In this lesson, we're going to go over the origins of prejudice, where it comes from, and maybe what can be done about it. The first theory that we're going to talk about is the realistic conflict theory. And this theory states that whenever two groups come into competition for the same resource, there'll be prejudice between the groups. The competition can be over any type of resource: social status, economic power, political power. But the more scarce the resource, the greater the frustration amongst each group, and perhaps the greater the amount of prejudice between them. The realistic conflict theory was really illustrated in a study done by Sharif called the Robbers Cave experiment. It showed that competition between two groups of boys at a summer camp easily built up to prejudice between the two groups. And so you might be saying, I'll now be wary of any free camp offers from social psychologists. As well you should be. But take heart, we're going to watch a little clip about the summer camp experience, but what you'll find is that prejudice was also able to be decreased. So in the clip, watch how prejudice is increased between the two groups and what these social psychologists do to try to decrease prejudice amongst the groups.
Back in the 50s, a social psychologist named Muzaffar Sharif asked the question, what is it exactly about groups that makes for such tension between them, and what can be done to reduce that tension? Well, Sharif and his colleagues decided to take this question outside of the lab and into the real world. Well, not really the real world, it was kind of an artificial situation, but they were able to create this artificial situation using pre-adolescent boys. What they did was they put on kind of a fake summer camp. They had two different groups of boys, of about 20 boys each. And the first week of this camp, they separated the boys, and the boys didn't know of the existence of the other group. So there were two different camps going on. What they did was they focused on group bonding at this time. As expected, about a week of activities brought these individuals close together as a group, as a team. In the second stage, what the researchers did was they introduced the groups to each other. And they created competition for resources where there could only be one winner and there has to be one loser. There were no prizes for second place, no consolation prizes. As expected, this kind of competition created a lot of tension between the two groups. At first it was just some verbal name-calling between the groups. And then it proceeded to vandalism and theft and even physical violence, to the point where the researchers had to physically separate the boys. Now comes stage 3. At this stage, the researchers created fake situations where the two groups had to work together in order to solve the problem. In one example, they pretended that the water for the camp was shut off in such a way that vandals must have done it. So all the boys had to work together to figure out this problem and resolve the problem. There were many such similar team-building activities between both groups, and at the end of the third stage, what they found was that the boys liked each other much more because of these team-building activities. At first, there was very strong in-group bias, where the team members just associated with other team members. But after these team-building events, where the groups actually got together to solve a common problem, they found out that they really liked each other a lot more than before. This whole experiment was a confirmation of Sharif's realistic conflict theory, which states that when there's competition for resources, negative feelings will arise. Now, over 50 years have passed since this first experiment. And what modern theories tell us is that A, this theory is correct, and B, one of the best ways to reduce this kind of out-group bias and this prejudice and discrimination we have for other groups is to socialize with the other groups, is to work towards a common cause.
So basically, prejudice was built up amongst the two group of boys by having them compete for resources in games where only one set of boys could win and receive the prize. And it really didn't take long for those boys to extremely dislike the other group. And I have here a sort of little flag that was from the original study and save, where they sort of, mock the other group. However, the prejudice was also decreased between the two groups of boys by having them work on superordinate goals, goals that required everybody's cooperation for the common good. So when the groups had to get together and legitimately work together to get something done, it reduced the prejudice between the two groups of boys, and you started seeing cross-group friendships. Another theory regarding the origin of prejudice is social categorization theory. And social categorization theory is a lot like Langer's mindfulness that we covered earlier, or back in chapter 3 when we talked about social norms and social categorizations, that we tend to categorize everything, including people. And once we categorize people into a particular group, it's very resistant to change. Once we stereotype, it kind of sticks, and it's difficult to get out of our consciousness. And then also, once we categorize people into groups, including ourselves, the group that we categorize ourselves into often seems to carry positive traits. And the group in which we group everyone else into tends to carry negative traits. So the group in which we share a common sense of identity and belonging is called the in-group, the group whom we are emotionally attached to, and that becomes the us. The out-group is any other group to which we don't belong and other people belong, and that becomes the them. And I sort of put some illustrations from the world of sporting, but you can see, you have the Boston Red Sox fans, the New York Yankees fans, and the Mets fans, and you can kind of see, with a little bit of humor over the years, how these different groups of people have interacted with each other in terms of in-group, out-group. And it's created over something very, very small, in this case sports, but there was one particular study that had done it even over eye color. So there was a teacher who was very interested in how in-groups, out-groups were forming over race, but she didn't use race. What she did was she used eye color. And she sorted the children into children who had blue eyes and children who had darker eyes, maybe brown or green. And then she started, some days she would ladle comments that were positive upon the blue-eyed children, show favoritism towards them, and other days she would do the same thing with the brown-eyed children. And what she found was that the children readily formed in-groups and out-groups over eye color. So much so that it was a little bit disturbing, and then much as in the robber's cave, she had to go back in and try to reestablish cross-group friendships. Children that had been friends before, quite readily, now separated themselves based on eye color. And so the social categorization comes about quite readily and quite easily, and also at a very young age. Lastly, how do we strike back against prejudice? Well, from some of the things we've learned, there are some situations that can be constructed that might lessen prejudice between groups. So if we have sort of issues in terms of groups developing prejudice towards each other, competing for resources, one of the first ideas was, well, if you take those groups and you kind of put them together and they have contact, they're going to start to build up friendships, they're going to start to reduce prejudice. And they did try it out, and unfortunately it didn't really work as well as expected. You can kind of think of it as if you really dislike somebody in the office, if they kind of just took you and that person and sort of stuffed you together on a project, you're probably going to keep disliking them, and you're probably not going to warm up to them in any particular way. So the theory was revised, and they found what really tended to reduce prejudice most had to involve cooperation and interdependence. So when the groups were given tasks that they had to work on together to cooperate, and it required interdependence, people tended to then recategorize each other. A person who was formerly viewed as an outgroup member now seemed to belong to the same group. So, gathering up people and just kind of putting them together doesn't always tend to reduce prejudice and can actually make things worse. It's getting legitimate tasks that people have sort of buy-in and emotional investment in, where they work together, that tends to reduce prejudice the most.